On a bitterly cold night in the heart of winter, a man sat alone in his small cabin nestled in the middle of a vast forest. His life was simple, filled with the peaceful solitude that came with being far from the noise and distractions of the world. The only company he had were the sounds of the wind howling outside and the occasional rustling of trees. The snow covered everything outside, turning the world into a blanket of white, a frozen wasteland where the cold seemed to stretch on endlessly. The man, though used to the isolation, enjoyed the calmness of his life. There was no one around to disturb him, no rush to get things done. His days were spent chopping wood for the fire, tending to his small garden, and making repairs to his cabin. He often found himself lost in thought, marveling at the stillness and the beauty of the forest around him. Yet, as much as he enjoyed the peace, there was always a sense of mystery and wonder that came with being so far removed from civilization. On this particular night, the man was curled up near the warmth of a crackling fire in his small living room. The shadows danced on the walls, and the sound of the fire popping and crackling filled the silence. The man was just about to close his eyes when something outside caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then the sounds grew louder, clearer. There were howls, strange, almost desperate-sounding howls coming from deep in the woods. The man frowned, sitting up straight. Wild animals weren't uncommon in these parts, but the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard before. It wasn't the usual growl or snarl of a bear or a pack of wolves. This was different. Curiosity got the better of him. He rose from his chair and grabbed a lantern off the table, holding it steady in his hand as he stepped toward the door. The snow had started to fall heavier, and the air was thick with the scent of cold earth and pine trees. As he opened the door and stepped outside, the wind hit him like a sharp slap across the face. The howl grew louder, and now it seemed to be coming closer. The man hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if it was a good idea to venture out into the cold night, especially not without knowing what he was dealing with. Still, something told him that the situation was urgent. As he ventured deeper into the snow-covered woods, the howls grew louder, more desperate. He moved quietly, careful to avoid making too much noise, his lantern casting long shadows in the dark forest. Soon, he came to a small clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying in the snow, were a pack of wolves. But something was terribly wrong. The wolves weren't moving, and their breathing was shallow. They looked like they had been out there for too long in the freezing cold. Their bodies were covered in ice, and their eyes were wide with pain and exhaustion. The man's heart raced as he looked at them. He had seen wolves in the wild before, but never in this state. He could see the pack leader, a large, strong-looking wolf, struggling to lift its head, its eyes locking onto his. The wolf didn't growl or snarl. Instead, it looked at him with a sense of pleading, almost as if asking for help. The man was taken aback by the look in the wolf's eyes. It wasn't the usual wild, untamed look he was used to. This was different. The wolf was looking at him as if it knew he could help. Without fully understanding why, the man knelt down, his hand reaching out instinctively. He knew he couldn't just leave them out here to die in the cold. Something inside him told him that he had to do something, anything, to save them. But what could he do? They were wild animals, not pets. Still, his heart swelled with compassion as he looked at the wolves, who were barely able to move. He wondered how they had gotten here and why they hadn't sought shelter somewhere else. But it didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was that they needed help. The man stood there in the cold, feeling the deep sense of urgency. The wolves were not just stranded in the snow. They were suffering, and he knew he had to act fast. He carefully studied the situation. The pack leader, the largest wolf, was still trying to rise, but it could barely lift its head. The other wolves were huddled together in a tight group, their fur stiff with ice, their eyes dull from exhaustion. The man felt his heart ache at the sight. He had always admired wolves for their strength and independence, but this pack was in no condition to survive on its own. He took a deep breath, his mind racing for a solution. He couldn't just leave them out here to die in the freezing cold, but at the same time, bringing them into his cabin seemed like a risky move. He had heard stories of wolves being dangerous, and the idea of inviting a pack into his home wasn't something he took lightly. But looking at the suffering creatures in front of him, he knew he had no choice. The cold wind cut through the forest like a sharp blade, and the man shivered. He could feel the freezing air creeping into his bones, but the sight of the wolves, especially the leader, kept him from turning back. It wasn't just the wolves that needed help. It was the look in their eyes. They weren't acting aggressively. Instead, they seemed weak, desperate, and most surprisingly, trusting. The pack leader's eyes locked onto his once more, a silent plea for help. The man could see that the wolf was trying to say something beyond the simple need for warmth. It was as if the wolf was trying to communicate that it and its pack were in dire need of human intervention, and the only person nearby was him. He hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Should he go back to his cabin and call for help, or should he try to bring the wolves into his home? The forest was so quiet, almost too quiet, as if waiting for him to make a decision. He looked at the wolves one more time and knew that waiting for help was not an option. The wolves needed him now. The man's heart made up his mind for him. Slowly, he knelt down to the pack leader's level, careful not to make any sudden movements. He spoke softly, trying to reassure the animal. "I'll help you," he said, his voice low and calm. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." With a gentle touch, he reached out toward the leader, and the wolf, sensing his intention, allowed him to help. The man could feel the animal's muscles trembling beneath his hand, the cold having seeped deep into its bones. He had to act quickly. The man looked around and realized that the snow was deep, and dragging the wolves back to his cabin would take too long. Instead, he decided to lead them there, step by step, offering whatever support he could. He started walking slowly toward the cabin, glancing back every so often to make sure the wolves were following. The leader remained close behind him, its eyes focused on him, as if understanding that this man was their only chance at survival. The wind howled through the trees, but the man's focus was solely on getting the wolves to safety. It wasn't just the cold that worried him. It was the fact that these animals were in pain, and time was running out. Every step felt like an eternity, but he kept going, determined to get them to warmth and shelter before it was too late. As they neared the cabin, the man could see the warmth glowing from the window. The fire inside would offer the wolves some comfort, but he still had doubts. Would they be safe inside? Could he keep them from panicking once they were out of the cold? The questions filled his mind, but he knew he didn't have time to worry. The wolves needed him now more than ever. As the man and the pack of wolves trudged through the deep snow, the cabin slowly came into view. The light from the warm fire flickered through the windows, offering a glimmer of hope for both the man and the animals. He could feel the cold biting at his skin, and he knew that the wolves were in even worse shape. Their steps were slow and labored, and he could see their bodies trembling from the chill. The leader, still limping, kept close behind him, its eyes constantly watching, as if it understood the importance of getting to safety. The man's heart raced as he quickened his pace. Every step felt heavier as he carried the weight of their situation. But the sight of the cabin, so close now, gave him the strength to push forward. The howling wind seemed to grow louder around them, but he focused on the path ahead. He couldn't afford to let the wolves down, not after everything they had been through. When they finally reached the door, the man wasted no time. He quickly swung it open, the warm air inside hitting him like a comforting embrace. The flickering light from the fire cast a golden glow across the room, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. The shelter of the cabin was within reach, but the work wasn't over yet. He had to get the wolves inside, make sure they were comfortable, and keep them safe. The leader wolf was the first to step inside, hesitating only for a second as it crossed the threshold. The man followed closely behind, watching the wolf closely. Its steps were slow and unsteady, but it managed to find its place near the fire. The other wolves followed, one by one, dragging their weary bodies into the warmth of the cabin. The man closed the door behind them, shutting out the harsh cold and the howling wind. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the soft, labored breathing of the wolves as they settled near the warmth. The man stood there, staring at the creatures that had been so desperate just moments ago. He couldn't help but marvel at the strange connection he felt to them, as if they shared something unspoken. He moved quickly, gathering blankets and anything else that might help. The wolves were still shivering, their fur stiff from the ice and snow. He placed the blankets around them, as gently as he could, trying not to disturb their rest. He didn't know how long they had been out there in the cold, but he could tell it had taken a toll on them. The pack leader lay closest to the fire, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. The other wolves, though still weak, seemed to relax as the warmth began to seep into their bodies. The man watched them carefully, not sure what to do next. He had never expected anything like this to happen. He had never imagined that he would be sharing his cabin with a pack of frozen wolves, and yet, here they were, safe from the cold for the moment. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, but there was still uncertainty. What had brought them to his doorstep in the first place? Why had they come to him for help? And why did the leader look at him with such an intense gaze, as if it recognized him? As he pondered these questions, he heard a soft sound from the leader. The wolf stirred, lifting its head just slightly to meet his gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and the man felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. It was as if the wolf was silently thanking him, acknowledging the kindness he had shown. The man was taken aback. He didn't know much about wolves, but he had never heard of them behaving like this, showing such trust toward a human. It was a moment he would never forget, a quiet exchange between man and animal that felt more meaningful than words could express. The fire continued to burn brightly, and the warmth filled the room, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this strange encounter than met the eye. The man stood in the center of the cabin, his eyes darting between the wolves, who were now comfortably settled by the fire, and the still, quiet night outside. The warmth of the cabin seemed to be doing wonders for the animals. They had stopped shivering, and though their breathing was still shallow, there was a sense of calm in the air that hadn't been there before. The man felt a sense of relief, but his mind was racing. He couldn't help but wonder what had led the wolves to his cabin in the first place. Why had they come all the way out here, to his doorstep? And why, above all, did the pack leader look at him with such an unusual intensity? The wolves lay still, their eyes half closed as they rested, the firelight casting shadows on their fur. The man couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this encounter than simply helping a pack of cold, stranded animals. He had heard of wolves being protective of their packs, but this felt different. The leader of the wolves, who had shown such trust in him, seemed to recognize him in some way. It was a strange feeling, one that left him questioning everything. He couldn't place it, but the connection felt deeper than just a man offering shelter to a pack of wild animals. He walked over to the fireplace, poking the fire to keep it alive, his thoughts swirling in his head. He had always prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who could understand the world around him through reason. But now, faced with the situation in his cabin, logic felt distant. The wolves were no longer the wild animals he had seen in the forest. There was something else here, something unspoken, a mystery that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The man paused, looking back at the wolves. The pack leader was staring at him, its eyes still locked onto his. For a moment, the man felt as if the wolf was searching his soul, trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand it. The look in the wolf's eyes was no longer one of pain or fear. It was calm, even grateful. But there was also something else, something the man couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the wolf knew something about him, something hidden in the depths of its animal instincts. He slowly sank into a chair near the fire, his gaze never leaving the leader of the pack. The wolves, though resting, were all around the room, their bodies still tense from the ordeal. Yet there was a certain peace in the air now. The man leaned back in his chair, allowing the warmth of the fire to settle into his bones. It had been a long night, and the exhaustion of both the physical labor and the mental strain was beginning to take its toll. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth envelop him, but he couldn't shake the thought that something unusual was unfolding right in front of him. What were the wolves doing here? How had they found him? There was something about the way they acted, the way they seemed to understand him, that made this encounter feel almost intentional. As the man sat there, lost in thought, the fire crackled softly in the background. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting in silence when suddenly the pack leader stirred again. It lifted its head slightly, its eyes meeting his once more. This time, there was something different in those eyes, something that told the man that the wolves weren't just here for warmth. They were here for something more, something he still couldn't quite understand. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The man could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken bond that had formed between him and the wolves. He wasn't sure what this connection meant, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary encounter, and whatever happened next would change everything. The man sat quietly in his chair, his eyes never leaving the wolves as they lay by the fire, their breath now steady and deep. The warmth of the cabin had worked wonders, and he could see that the pack had begun to relax. Their once tense bodies were now at ease, their muscles no longer stiff from the cold. It was a relief to see, but something in the back of his mind still nagged at him. What had drawn these wolves to his doorstep? Why had they come to him specifically? The pack leader, the large wolf who had been so desperate for shelter, was now resting with its head resting on its paws. Its eyes were half closed, but it still kept glancing up at the man every so often. The man couldn't help but feel that the wolf was aware of him in some way, as if it was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand it. The connection between them was undeniable, and though he couldn't explain it, he knew it was more than just an animal seeking refuge from the cold. He stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the wolves. They had fallen into a peaceful silence, their bodies relaxed and their breathing calm. He walked over to the fireplace, the warmth of the fire comforting as it flickered in the hearth. He needed to gather his thoughts. The questions were starting to build up in his mind, each one more confusing than the last. Why had the wolves come to his cabin? Why had they sought him out when there were so many other places they could have gone? Was there something more to this than just helping a pack of cold animals? The man took a deep breath, trying to clear his thoughts. He had always lived a simple life, but now, in the presence of these creatures, everything felt more complicated. He couldn't deny the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter. The wolves had sought him out, and there was a reason for that. The pack leader's eyes were full of something he couldn't quite place. It was as if the wolf knew him, knew who he was in a way that was beyond his understanding. As he turned back to the wolves, he noticed the pack leader was now sitting up, its head lifted slightly. It had a certain calmness about it, but there was also a quiet strength in its gaze. The other wolves had settled down as well, their eyes closed in rest. The man couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. These were wild animals, creatures of the forest, and yet they had come to him for help. It was a humbling thought. The man sat back down, watching the pack leader carefully. The wolf seemed to be waiting for something. Maybe it was waiting for the man to make a move, or maybe it was waiting for him to understand something that was beyond his grasp. The air in the cabin felt heavy with anticipation, and the man could sense that something was about to happen. He just didn't know what. As the fire crackled and the wolves rested, the man found himself thinking about the strange bond he felt with these creatures. It was a bond that seemed to go beyond words, beyond actions. It was something deeper, something primal. The wolves had chosen him, and that thought lingered in his mind, making him feel both honored and uncertain. Whatever had brought them here, whatever had caused them to seek him out, was something he couldn't yet understand. But he knew one thing for sure. This night, this strange encounter, would stay with him forever. As the night wore on, the warmth of the fire continued to fill the cabin, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The man watched the wolves, their bodies relaxed now, their breath steady and deep. The tense energy that had once surrounded them had dissolved, and in its place was a quiet peace that seemed almost surreal. It was a relief to see them resting comfortably, but a lingering question still hung in the air. The pack had arrived in desperate need, but what had brought them to his door? Why had they chosen him of all people to seek refuge with? The leader of the pack, the large wolf that had been the most desperate to find shelter, lay closest to the fire. Its fur, once stiff with ice, was now soft and relaxed. The man had noticed how the wolf's eyes kept darting up to meet his gaze, as if silently trying to communicate something. Every time their eyes met, the man felt a strange connection, one that was hard to explain. It wasn't just an animal seeking warmth. There was a deeper, unspoken understanding between them, something that transcended the simple need for shelter. The man had lived a quiet life, far from the complexities of the world, but this strange encounter was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had always been a person who believed in logic and reason, yet now, with the wolves at his side, the world seemed filled with mystery. He didn't know why they had come, or what they were trying to tell him, but he couldn't deny the connection he felt. It was as though the wolves knew something that he didn't, something that was hidden beneath the surface of their quiet, watchful eyes. Sitting near the fire, the man allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had always been a solitary person, preferring the stillness of nature to the bustling noise of human life. But now, in the presence of these creatures, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. The wolves were not just visitors in his cabin. They had come to him for help, and in doing so, they had placed their trust in him. It was a trust that he could not take lightly. As he watched them, the man felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The wolves, though they had settled in and were resting, seemed more alert now, as if they were aware of something in the air. The leader, especially, seemed to be focused on something beyond the fire, its eyes scanning the room with a sharp intensity. The man couldn't help but wonder if there was something else at play here, something more than just the need for shelter. The night outside was still and cold, but the cabin felt like a sanctuary for the wolves, a place of warmth and safety that they had not had for so long. The man knew that they were in no condition to survive another night out in the harsh wilderness. They needed the shelter, and he had offered it freely. But as the minutes passed, he realized that he had given them more than just physical protection. He had opened up his life to them, shared his space and his warmth, and in return, they had given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of connection, a sense of being part of something greater. He stood up quietly and moved toward the window, looking out into the vast expanse of snow and trees. The stillness of the night was almost overwhelming. It was as if the world outside had frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. And perhaps it was. Maybe the wolves had come here not just to find refuge, but to bring a message that the man was still trying to understand. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. This night, and the bond that had formed between him and the wolves, would never be forgotten. The fire continued to crackle softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the cabin. The man stood by the window, gazing out at the silent, snow-covered woods. His mind was filled with thoughts that were both clear and clouded. The wolves were now resting, their bodies relaxed, and their breathing deep. The tension in the air had shifted, and the peace that had settled over them seemed to reflect in the man's own thoughts. Yet, despite the calm, there was an unease that lingered just beneath the surface. Something wasn't quite right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the wolves' presence in his life was about more than just finding refuge from the cold. He turned back to look at them. The pack leader, the one who had first approached him with those pleading eyes, lay close to the fire, still alert but no longer shivering. Its fur had softened as the warmth filled its body, but its eyes remained focused, searching the room as if looking for something. The other wolves were settled as well, their bodies curled up beside the fire, but their heads remained slightly lifted, as though they too were aware of something the man couldn't yet comprehend. The man couldn't stop thinking about the way the leader had looked at him when they had first met. The wolf's eyes had held something, an understanding, a connection, that he couldn't put into words. It was almost as if the wolf had known him, or had recognized him in some way. The thought was unsettling, yet at the same time, it felt strangely comforting. There was a bond between them, and it was as if they had known each other far longer than just the few hours they had spent together. The man paced slowly across the room, his thoughts racing. What was going on here? Why had the wolves come to him? And why did it feel as though they were waiting for something? It was as if they were anticipating something, as if they knew that he would play a part in whatever was to come. The quiet weight of the moment pressed on him, and he felt the uncertainty creeping back into his mind. Suddenly, the leader of the pack lifted its head, its eyes locking with his. The man froze. There was something in the way the wolf looked at him that felt different now. It wasn't just the silent plea for help that had been there before. Now the wolf's gaze was more intense, more knowing. The air in the cabin seemed to shift, and the firelight flickered as if the room itself was reacting to the change. The man's heart skipped a beat. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the wolf was waiting for him to understand something. A message, perhaps, or a truth that had been hidden from him up until now. The man's breath caught in his throat as the wolf slowly stood up, its movements deliberate and strong. It was clear that the animal was not just tired from the journey. It had regained its strength, its posture now proud and confident. It moved toward the man, its eyes never leaving his. The other wolves stirred as well, lifting their heads in unison as if they, too, recognized something shifting in the air. With a soft growl, the leader of the pack stepped closer to the man. The man stood still, unsure of what was happening, but feeling an undeniable pull to follow the wolf's lead. As the wolf approached, the room seemed to grow even warmer, the fire crackling more intensely. There was a sense of anticipation that hung in the air, as if something important was about to unfold. The wolf reached the man's feet and stopped, its eyes now filled with an intensity that made his heart race. The man reached down slowly, almost instinctively, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near the wolf's head. As his fingers brushed against its fur, a strange sensation washed over him, one that he couldn't explain. It was as if the world outside had faded away, and there was nothing left but the two of them, connected in a way that went beyond the physical. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man was no longer just a stranger to the wolf. It was as if a bond had been formed between them, something deeper than either could understand. The wolf's eyes softened, and the man felt a sense of peace settle over him, as if he had been chosen for something greater. The pack stood silently around him, watching the exchange between their leader and the man, their eyes filled with the same knowing expression. The man's mind was spinning. What had just happened? What had this connection meant? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. The wolves had come to him for a reason, and now, as he stood there, he felt that he was part of something much larger than himself. The bond between them was undeniable, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew that this was just the beginning of something he could never have imagined. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, its warm glow filling the room as the man stood silently, his hand resting gently on the head of the wolf. The bond between them felt almost tangible, as if it had been woven in the very air they breathed. The pack, once so distant and cold, now surrounded him in quiet reverence, their eyes still watching him with a strange intensity. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move, to understand what this connection truly meant. The man took a deep breath, his mind still spinning with the events of the night. He had offered shelter to the wolves out of compassion. But now, as he stood there in the presence of these creatures, everything felt different. He wasn't just a man helping a pack of stranded animals. He was part of something far greater, something that transcended his understanding. The wolves had chosen him, and in that choice, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. A responsibility that he didn't fully comprehend, but knew he had to honor. The leader of the pack, still resting near the fire, turned its gaze toward the man once more. There was a quiet understanding in the wolf's eyes, as if it was acknowledging the man's role in whatever had brought them here. The other wolves had settled into a peaceful rest, their bodies no longer tense, their breathing steady. It was clear that the shelter had done its work, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that the wolves' arrival was no accident. There was something more at play here, something he was only beginning to understand. As he looked around the room, his gaze fell on the snow-covered world outside the window. The storm had passed, and the night was still. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft hush of the snow beneath the quiet moonlight. The cabin, once a solitary refuge from the world, now felt like a gateway to something new, something mysterious. The wolves had come to him, and in doing so, they had changed everything. They had brought him a sense of purpose, a sense of connection to the natural world that he had never known before. It was as if, through this strange encounter, he had been awakened to a deeper understanding of his place in the world. He knew he couldn't turn away from this. The wolves had shown him something beyond survival, beyond the simple act of helping those in need. They had shown him the power of trust, of connection, and of the quiet strength that lay within all living things. The man realized that he wasn't just a caretaker for these creatures. He was part of their story, part of the mysterious journey that had brought them here. The pack leader slowly rose to its feet, its eyes locking with the man's once more. There was no fear in its gaze, no uncertainty. Instead, there was a quiet strength, a sense of purpose that the man couldn't ignore. The wolf seemed to be telling him that their time together was coming to an end, that it was time for them to move on. The other wolves, sensing this shift, began to stir, standing up and stretching their limbs. The man watched in silence, unsure of what to say or do. He had helped them find warmth, but now, it seemed, they were ready to return to the wild. The pack leader walked slowly toward the door, pausing to look back at the man one last time. The man felt a pang of sadness, realizing that this moment, this connection, was fleeting. But he also felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been part of something extraordinary, something that had opened his eyes to the beauty and mystery of the world around him. With a final glance, the leader of the pack stepped into the snow, the other wolves following closely behind. The man watched as they disappeared into the quiet night, their forms blending into the white landscape. He stood there for a moment, his heart filled with both a sense of loss and a quiet peace. The wolves had come to him for a reason, and now they were gone, but the connection they had shared would stay with him forever. As the last wolf vanished into the distance, the man closed the door behind him and turned back to the warmth of the fire. The world outside was still, and the cabin felt more like home than it ever had before. He knew that he would never forget the night the wolves came to him, and the strange, unspoken bond they had shared. It was a reminder that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, the world reveals itself in ways we never could have imagined.